What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 400. Wow, this is episode number 456. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from sunny Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas.
Yeah, it is nice and sunny still. We haven't quite gotten into fall. So
I nailed it.
And in a stunning twist from normal, I'm going to be getting on a plane to go to a Grand Prix, and you are not.
Yes. How did this happen? This never happens. So who are you playing with? What are you playing? Where are you headed?
So, as your question kind of implies, I'm playing in a team Grand Prix. It's Team Unified Modern. So any card that appears in one of the three decks can't appear in another deck besides basic land. I'm playing with Pat Cox and Gabby Sparts, and they were locked before the Team GP was even announced on playing Humans and Tron, respectively. So that basically let me play anything that wasn't...
What did that leave you?
Basically anything that wasn't an Ancient Stirrings deck, because Tron plays that, or an Ether Vial / Noble Hierarch deck, because that's where Humans is at. And as a result, I think that I'm going to end up pretty happy. I'm playing a Jeskai deck, which is like Jeskai Control, which if it's good, I have to give credit for Ben Stark, but if it's bad, I also have to give credit to Ben Stark because it's got some interesting choices. I've got, Hieroglyphic Illumination, Teferi, Settle the Wreckage. I'm basically playing a standard blue-white deck with some lightning bolts. So we'll see how it goes.
Hey, you got the good bolts with you?
Oh yeah. Beta bolts all the way. The same ones I've cast for 10 years.
Awesome. More than that. I'm going to take you the over on 10 years. If you're listening to this show the day it comes out, you will be able to watch the coverage of that GP on the weekend. So make sure you tune in for that. And the reason I'm not going is because I'm covering Japanese nationals here from Seattle. We're getting the files sent over to us, and then I'm going to be at Wizards of the Coast headquarters broadcasting that. So a lot of Magic this weekend for those of you that like to watch on twitch.tv/magic in this case. All right. We've got a big Q&A show lined up here. Ton of awesome questions. I went through all of them before we got on the show. So let's get right into it. First things first, channelfireball.com. They are the sponsor of this podcast, and they are the place to go for everything you need Magic related on ye olde internet. That's right. You're going to find it at Channel Fireball. We know you have a lot of choices. Hell, there's a lot of good choices out there. Let's not beat around the bush. Some really good websites, some good stuff. But we think that you will really enjoy your experience over at channelfireball.com. They're going to get their stuff shipped out to you very quickly. They're a great company that will stand behind their product, and they'll take care of you. If you have any issues with anything, just let them know, and they'll do their best to fix it for you. Of course, you can find everything you need, sealed product, singles, cards like Kozilek's Return. If you happen to need one of those, you'll be able to find on channelfireball.com right now. And you can, of course, get sealed product as well. Like if you want to get, say, a booster box, you can also pre-order stuff on Channel Fireball. So let me look, actually. Do you think the thing's up yet? Are we that close?
Ravnica pre-orders are up, yes.
That's right. So Guilds of Ravnica, pre-order right now. You can get a bunch of different options on the pre-order, and they're going to get it in the mail as quickly as they can. The day they're allowed to ship it to you, it will be in the mail, and you'll have it in your hands so you can get a draft going with your
I was going to say grubby little hands, but our listeners are a higher class than that. So
that's right. They wash their hands. Channelfireball.com. Place to go. Patreon. That is really the heart and soul of our listener base is on patreon.com/limited resources. Support the show. Thank you to each and every one of you do. One of the amazing things that you get from doing something like Patreon is that you get a really good connection with your listenership. And that is expressed sometimes through shows like this one, where we're going to be answering your questions directly. This gives us a direct line to our most dedicated fans and lets them ask us the questions that they want. And Luis and I love doing these shows because it's such a huge range of topics. It's kind of like, we got to put on our battle suits and start taking questions. And we love that.
One of the things I think is really cool is that listeners have a lot of different interests and a lot of different good questions. And, to some extent, we try to predict what people want to hear and hear about rather. And that's what we discuss on the show. But it is cool when it comes directly from the horse's mouth, as it were.
So they have clean hooves now.
Yeah.
But
yeah. All right, I knew that we were going somewhere with that.
We've got one more Crack-A-Pack for good old M19 before we send it on its way. This one comes from Lance Hartbarger. Thank you so much, Lance, for the pack. I met him at the GP over the weekend. First card out, Omen Speaker.
I do like Omen Speaker. It's better in this format than it has been in others, just because, blocking ground things is pretty good. I wouldn't be happy to first pick it, but it wouldn't be the end of the world.
No. Lava Axe, no. Inspired Charge, not first picking it. Two-Headed Zombie, no. All right, Pizza Delivery Oracle?
Yes, the Rocks Oracle. I think I would rather first pick Omen Speaker because blue 2-drops are less replaceable than green 5-drops. There's Thornhide Wolves, which is a serviceable 5 as well. You end up not needing the 5-drop as often.
Yeah, I agree. Gallant Cavalry, 3 and a white 2/2. You get an extra 2/2. They both have Vigilance. Card's fine, but I'm still not really seeing anything that's jumping out. Here's one that I like a lot.
I'm not that excited taking a 4-mana card either. Gallant Cavalry is fine, but like you said, but it's not exciting.
Sky Scanner.
Oh, I do like Sky Scanner. It's kind of like an Omen Speaker, except it's colorless.
Right.
So I would rather just start that way. I think Sky Scanner is excellent.
I do too, and that's the card I would take here. Another card I like quite a bit, Salvager of Secrets. That's a 3 blue 2/2, and when it ETBs, you can get an instant or sorcery back from your yard.
I do like Salvager. I'm not over the moon about it because you do need to pick up good spells, and that actually can be an issue both in a normal draft or any draft, and particularly in some color combinations. If you end up like blue-green, you can end up with 2 spells in your deck. So it's kind of like a blue-black / blue-red card. Like green and white don't leverage it very well.
Yeah, it's also just very slow. I'm still on Sky Scanner. Sovereign's Bite, that will not change my mind.
I've died to that card.
Really bad. Same, like a couple times. Boggart Brute, that's a good one. 2 and a red 3/2 with Menace. This thing is good in a beatdown deck.
Yeah, Boggart Brute's good. I don't think it's as good as Sky Scanner. Pick one.
Same.
I mean, look, the bar here to take a colorless card, it has to be quite a bit better. Like it can't just be a little better. It has to be quite a bit better because colorless cards you always get to put in your deck. Boggart Brute, you could just end up black-white and you'd be out of first pick.
Yeah. Uncommons, we got some nice ones here. First one is Leonin Vanguard, white for a 1/1. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you gain a life, and it gets +1/+1 if you control 3 or more creatures.
I think this card is serviceable, but I haven't run into that many decks where I actually do want it.
Yeah, it's fine. Better than I thought it was, but still not great.
Played against that card in Standard at the Team Pro Tour.
Ooh, cat deck?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, well, it was green, white cats, and we were 0-3 at the time, so there might be some connections there.
Oh, man. Bone to Ash.
I like Bone to Ash. So there's some formats, like this showed up originally in Innistrad, and it was marginal. It wasn't a card you were particularly excited about. Often you didn't play it, whereas here I almost always play it. It's just the format is slow enough that you can just start with Bone to Ash in your deck, and I think end up making a nice little profit.
So have we exceeded the Sky Scanner threshold?
No, I would still take Sky Scanner if that.
I would too.
I guess that was not clear.
Although this next one, I would actually take over Sky Scanner, which is Declare Dominance.
Oh, I do like Declare Dominance. This is the 3 green sorcery, give a creature +3/+3, and it has to be blocked by every creature that can block it. So it's a pretty marked difference from other effects like this. Like there was the 3 green, give a creature +7/+7. It has to be blocked by 1 creature.
Yep,
something like that. They have to throw everything in front of this. So if they tap out on turn 4 for their 3rd creature, you can sometimes wipe all 3.
Or just win the game. You can put it on one of your smaller creatures.
Yes, it lets all your creatures get through unblocked as well. So Declare Dominance is a really powerful card, and this format lends itself nicely to that. So yeah, I would be happy first picking Declare Dominance. Yeah,
this is the kind of card you have to be careful with because the blowout potential is so high with a 5-mana sorcery, that you really do want to pick your spot. But when you do, it will often have a game swinging effect. And I like that a lot. So I just go for the peak power here and take Declare Dominance over Sky Scanner. But we've got 2 more cards, actually. One of them is Highland Lake. That's the blue-red dual land, which we're not taking here. Though I would actually take the rare over Declare Dominance. It's Gin of Wishes.
Ooh, I do like Gin of Wishes. This is one of the best cards in the set. A 5-mana 4/4 flyer is already great, and it comes into play with 3 wish counters on it. You can pay 2 blue and remove a wish counter to exile your top card, and then you get to play that card.
Yeah, without paying its mana cost.
Yeah, it is a sweet one.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Gin of Wishes, and I would windmill it here, and I'd be actually really quite happy about that. Okay. We'll be doing the Sunset Show next week for M19, so more on that later. And for now, though, let's get right into our Q&A. We've got a lot of questions to answer here, and we're going to get through as many of them as we can. The first one comes from Glory, who says, when is a gold card good enough to be pack one, pick one worthy? She says,
That's
also,
like segues nicely from our pack we just talked about.
It does indeed. Also love the podcast, and y'all were absolute gentlemen when I met y'all. I wonder where Glory's from at various GPs this summer. Thanks for putting up with
I'm just wondering why she thought we were gentlemen.
Yeah, I wonder who she actually met. Thanks, Glory, for the question and for coming up to say hi at the GPs. Hopefully we'll see you at another one. Great question. When is a gold card good enough to be pack one, pick one worthy? There's a pretty high bar for that.
So the bar is basically at or slightly above the best common in the set. So, frequently the best common in the set is going to be a card that you're not unhappy taking first. In fact, you're kind of glad. You're like, oh, I opened Lightning Strike or, whatever the best common is in that particular format. And you end up first picking it a lot of the time. You see it, even if it's not quite as good as one of the bomb uncommons. Mm-hmm. To first pick a gold card, it has to be at that level. So it has to be, like Lich's Caress, I think might be the best common in M19, right? So,
yeah.
Or it is competitive for that regardless of how you feel. And so if I were to first pick a gold card, it would have to kind of clear that bar most of the time. It obviously depends on the pack, but something like, Brawl Bash Ogre is just not there. Like that card is just, it's okay, but it's just not that good. And something like Skyrider Patrol is that good. The thing is, the follow-up to this question is, when is it worth taking a gold card over a monocolor card? Let's go back to this example of Skyrider Patrol and Lich's Caress. Mm-hmm. I think that these cards are very close in power level. I think if they were both colorless, Skyrider Patrol would be a little bit better, but they're not. And as a result, I would probably end up taking the monocolor card over the multicolor card when they're that close. I think that the tiebreaker adjusts it by about a half a point on a scale of 10, maybe a little bit more. And it's really valuable to know when you're supposed to diverge from that, or when you're supposed to take the gold card. It basically ends up like you have to take gold cards as if they're like, if you want to take them first pick, as if they're, again, like something close to like a bomb uncommon or slightly above the best common.
Right. And that is a very high bar, right? I mean, relative to all the things we have, that's about the highest bar that we get. So it is worth, like, just from sort of a visceral standpoint, you should look at that pack and that card should scream at you. I mean, you should be like, that's a card that I want to play, that I know will help win me the game anytime that I get to cast it in a meaningful way. Not just I added a creature to the board, but like, that could be one of the best cards in my whole deck if I get there. In order for it to be worth taking the risk, because again, you will not play it a good portion of the time.
Right.
And that's a big risk.
Another thing that really goes into this is how splashable the card is. Skyrider Patrol is not the best splash because it's at its best when you can play and activate it in the same turn. But let's say something like Chromium, right? The Esper Dragon. I mean, first of all, you're going to splash Chromium a lot because it's a 3-color card in a 2-color format, but it's the kind of card you want to splash. Or Tatiova, if you want to go back to Dominaria, right? The Dominaria had a lot of powerful gold cards. Tatiova, Benthic Druid was the 3 blue-green 3/3 that whenever you play a land, you gain a life and draw a card. Like, you would splash Tatiova in your blue-black decks or blue-red decks or green-black decks all the time. Because when you draw Tatiova on turn 9 or you draw your Forest on turn 9, the card is still quite effective and it'll take over a game. Some gold cards are just not the kind that you splash. Like there was the 1 green-red 3/3 trample. All your creatures have trample, like the Kenra Chariot Rider or whatever from Amonkhet. That's just not the kind of card you want to splash because so much of the power level of that card is in the fact that it costs, it's a 3-mana 3/3. Right. So you have to be really careful to know where this gold card's power comes from, because some gold cards are great splashes. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, right? It's a Windmill Slam Bomb. You're going to splash it if you're either of those colors. And in some cases, you'll put Grow from Ashes in your black-green deck and try to play Teferi anyway. The card is just that absurd. Mm-hmm. Whereas some of the gold cards get a lot of mileage out of how cheap they are and how efficient they are, and those are not the cards you tend to want to splash.
Yeah, the way that I like to think about it is, does it matter when I play this card? And if the answer is no, then you're more likely to splash it. And if the answer is yes, and especially the further towards the end of yes that you get, the least likely you are to splash it.
Because, I mean, there are some really good aggressive gold cards, like Skynet Legionnaire. Like, if we're going back to Ravnica, we might see this one, right? This is the 1 red-white 2/2 Flying Haste. That card doesn't beat it.
Yes.
But that card's not a splashable card really because it's a beating because it comes out on turn 3. So yeah, this is a great question, especially going back to Ravnica where we tend to see a lot of the powerful gold cards. You're looking to splash cards like Detention Sphere, right, or Sphinx's Revelation. You're not as much looking to splash cards that get a lot of the Rakdos cards, right, of the last time got a lot of their value because they were efficient and powerful when they came out on curve.
Yeah, either when they came out early or if you cast them at a very specific time, and both of those are things that should take away from your want to splash. Great question, Glory. Next one comes from Kyle. Hey guys, what's a good one-on-one limited format I should try? I was looking at Winston drafting and it seems like fun, but I haven't tried it yet, and there are lots of others. I have played Winston. It is fun. It's a legit draft format in the sense that it's challenging. It makes you think. It is good to go up against somebody else, and you start to understand the depth of it a little bit. After you do maybe 2 or 3 of them, you'll start to go, oh, I see. I can try to actually get you here by, figuring out what you're doing and then trying to bait you into taking different cards. Or taking or not taking different piles, and it can be pretty interesting. Another one that I like.
I would just Google Winston draft. To find out. It's pretty simple once you kind of see it laid out, but it's a little difficult to explain.
Yeah, and so we'll do that. And then another one that I really like is one that Ryan Spain, original co-host of the show, developed on his own. It's called Rooster Draft. It's kind of a mix of a couple of different ones, and it's actually even a little bit more simplified down. And I'm not going to explain it on here because it is a little bit, it's a little cumbersome via audio, but I have a link to a Google Doc that I'll put in the show notes that you can see. And it's a really fun, kind of quicker, kind of hey, we've got a little bit of time to fill. Let's do one real quick type of thing rather than like a super deep experience. But it also means that you can do it over and over again. And it can be really fun. It's also just another way to use up loose booster packs that you happen to have.
Yeah. I like Pai Gao, which is another fun one.
Yeah.
I talked about that at one point, which was basically you open a booster pack and you make 4 3-card piles, and then you duel those piles against your opponent with infinite mana and a starting life of 5 life. It's pretty fun.
It is really fun. Yeah. Try those out, Kyle. They're all not as good as just doing a 6-person or 8-person draft, but they're all pretty fun if you don't have enough people around. Michael says, hi guys, I love your show. I've been listening every week for over a year now. I'm definitely a vastly better player for having listened to your advice and tips. I won heaps of boosters and joined your Patreon to prove this to be true. Thanks, Michael. I have very little GP experience, only the one. I found that people would shuffle my deck and blatantly stare at my cards. The same happens rarely in booster draft as well. How do I approach this rude behavior? At the moment, I have a mental internal implode of sorts and probably flush red. Michael, good question. This is something that comes up at tournaments actually quite a bit, which is not everybody's on the same page with where they're supposed to be. And we talked last week with TBS about this and, about when you start playing more competitive, especially higher rules enforcement level events, what ends up happening is you start to realize that the really serious and professional players have a real sense of them of, I am going to go out of my way to show you that I'm not doing anything untoward, right? There is an onus on each person to really show the other person that I'm not doing anything and could not be doing anything that could be construed as unsportsmanlike or cheating or, getting an advantage or angle shooting or anything like that. And so what you'll often see when players of that caliber shuffle is they take the deck and whichever way the bottom of the cards are facing, they fully look the other direction. I mean, it looks like they're looking off, into space or something like that while they shuffle the deck. And they just get used to doing this. And this is so that you can't just sort of do a little peek look down and go, oh, this person's on blue-green. Interesting. And then maybe I'll keep a different hand when I do this, or maybe I saw a specific card that was a combat trick that I could play around, or maybe I'll know what to sideboard or whatever, get an unfair advantage in doing that. The awkward part that Michael's referring to here is that not everybody's on that same page. So you sit down and your opponent might just stare down at their hands while they're shuffling because maybe they're not that good at shuffling, or they don't really understand that looking at your deck is probably not, with it
is a bit of a faux
integrity. Yeah, it's a faux pas to do that, but they might not know that. So you've played way more tournaments than I have, Luis. When you see somebody doing that, Do you gently let them know? Do you yell at them? Like what's your your take here?
Marshall, you've watched me play a lot of matches, and
oh yeah,
basically my how I approach almost all of these things, whether it's them looking at my cards while shuffling or them missing like a point of damage off a pain land or any like minor like tournament infraction thing, is if it's not like something that I think is egregious or on purpose, it's something that like the first one is kind of free. Like I'll be pretty gentle the first time. Like, I'll be like, oh, hey, can you just angle the deck away from you? Like I don't want it to look like you're looking at the cards or whatever. Or, oh, hey, you forgot to take a point of damage. On the second time, I'll call a judge. Cause basically the way I see it is, there's a lot of reasons to call a judge the first time, especially if you think your opponent is doing something on purpose or nefarious. But honestly, like my philosophy of like the first time someone does something wrong, if it's a minor mistake, I would rather not, go completely like 0 to 60, like, and start berating them, because most of the time it's a mistake. I've had exceptions. Like it's actually really funny. This is against some fans of the show. Me, Josh Utterlane and Pat Cox played at a team Grand Prix, and one of the guys who I was playing against leaned over and told his teammate, and I could kind of hear him, that he saw a card in my deck as I was shuffling. And that was because maybe I wasn't shuffling like quite well enough that they couldn't see or whatever.
Yeah, well, it's weird with a team event because you're not used to having Yeah, okay.
Right. You have to be very careful. And I'm like, okay, guys, can we not do that? And they're like, well, we just want any edges, basically. Like, and I end up saying like, because we had talked about LR already, and I was just like, that's really not the philosophy of the show. Like, it's interesting. Like, we kind of got into it a little bit, and they ended up, the guy who did that ended up apologizing and being like, okay, whatever, we won't do that or whatever. But it was just kind of funny that like, that this comes up. But basically, I would not like, the listener here, Michael. It sounds like this is making you pretty angry or uncomfortable. I would try to dial it back a little bit. Like, I understand that this is your natural reaction. And I think the downside of a lot of people acting badly at tournaments is that it gives people what I believe mistaken impression that everything your opponent does that's wrong is malicious. And I just have not found that to be the case. I found in general, the people I play against at Magic tournaments, when they make a mistake, it's a mistake, and there's not huge amounts of ill intent. Like, yes, people have tried to cheat against me, but most of the time it's not that. It's just someone's nervous and they're just looking at their hands because that's what they normally do when they shuffle or whatever. And you end up in a spot, I believe, where if the first time your opponent makes a mistake, you treat it as just a mistake, and you just like, you kind of gently ask them or remind them not to do the thing that they're doing, you'll end up being pretty happy with the result. Most of the people I played against are oh yeah, sorry, my bad.
Okay. Yeah. And Michael does have the right, though, to say, hey, let's make sure we're not looking down when we're shuffling or something, right?
Yeah, for sure. Just if your opponent's doing something you don't like, you can generally ask them about it. And if it's a big issue, just call a judge. There's nothing wrong with calling a judge. I don't want to give anyone that impression. I think calling a judge is a great tool.
Good. Okay. Next question comes from different Michael, who says, we have various types of draft and sealed. Can you come up with a new type of limited format? If not, which limited format would most likely to be made available digitally? Luis, come up with a new format.
Well, this is something I do at work.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. So I guess since Michael's not paying you for this one, maybe you should keep that one to yourself. You actually do all of these things at work, right? The digital part too.
Yeah. I work on for those who don't know, I'm gonna plug it again. I work on a digital card game called Eternal, and I'm one of the people who work on new game modes and new kind of events, and it's always interesting trying to figure out what was going to be the most fun.
Yeah. And I think the thing with his second question, which limited format would you most like to be made available digitally? I mean, I always just want to play draft when possible, but sealed deck type stuff does have a good application because you can do it by yourself, and take your time with the building. Though the decoupling, we're going to talk about Arena in a little bit, drafting on it, but right now it uses AI. So the draft, you can actually take as long as you want or even interrupt it. Important question here from Joel says, sub sandwiches or wraps?
Well, wraps are just fake burritos. So if you're going to do that, just have a burrito. In general,
totally. Sub sandwiches.
Yeah, I prefer sub sandwiches.
Not even close. I don't even think I like wraps. I'm just off a wrap sometime.
A wrap is just something masquerading as a burrito. Like I said, like if you're gonna go through that trouble, just get a burrito.
It's living a lie. Michelle says, which guild of Ravnica do you each identify with?
So I believe that first of all, the quiz I took gave me Is It, which I think is a pretty reasonable place to land.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if I was more Demir, though.
I know you see yourself that way. The world sees you as gruel.
No, come on.
Just holding a large piece of wood and growling for another piece of meat.
The world sees me as pure Azorius, as they should. That's how you can tell I'm Demir.
Yeah, there you go. Mine is Simic, for sure. If I have to pick only two colors, I go Simic.
A Simic, but with also your own bit of gruel.
Yeah, I unlike you, will not deny it. Tyler says, hey, Marcel and Luis, love the show. Keep up the good work. Do you guys have any thoughts on how to have the Pro Tour both involve teams and limited? Top cut team draft seems spicy, but the logistics in Swiss seem rough. Would something like rotating the standard player between standard and draft day 1 and then the modern player between modern and draft day 2 make sense? Love to hear your take on something if this would be possible and enjoyable. So I guess Tyler wants to do a mixed format GP.
Yeah, I think that the best way to go about that would be like 3 rounds of team sealed and then 4 rounds of team constructed. I really like the format that we had at the last Team Pro Tour, where one player plays standard, one plays modern, one plays legacy, just because the Team Unified is fun too, but the decks you use at Team Unified sometimes end up being a little weird. Whereas when it's just standard, modern, legacy, any viewer of the Pro Tour can look at those decks and just be pretty confident those decks look like they're correct.
Yeah. So, and then Team Sealed is like just a really good format. Like
Team Sealed is a great format.
Yeah. So I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel there. Matthew says, hey, Marcel and LSV, did you do any chaos drafts while they were up on Magic Online? Do you have any thoughts or newly discovered pet cards? I found it to be a surprisingly fun format and really want extra arms to get a reprint now. And Matthew wants to know if he wants to let Scott-Vargas on extra arms. Do you know what that does?
Yeah, I think that's the 4 in a red enchantment that when the creature attacks, it deals 2 damage to any target.
Yep, that's exactly what it is, obviously. I did, I think 5 or 6 chaos drafts. I put up a video on CFB of one of them. In fact, the first one, I believe. Traditionally, I've really liked Chaos Draft because it kind of challenges your fundamentals of draft. You have to figure it out on the fly, and it really kind of rewards base level card evaluation and understanding how to build a good fundamental limited deck. But I have to say, I didn't really love it. It just felt so disheveled, and like every time it was so all over the map that, yeah, I was still doing the basics. I was reading the table the best I could. I was, reading a lot of cards. I mean, at this point in my Magic career, most of the sets I actually have drafted that were on it, but there were still quite a few that I haven't. And there's this weird thing too, Luis, where the further you go back, somehow the more text there is on most of the sets. Some of them are just insanely complicated,
Yeah, I think that's a testament to, I'm not going to stand by every single design we've seen in the last couple of years, but in general, the limited designs have really improved. And especially when you're looking at Chaos Draft, where sets from pre-2000-ish, like they had no shame. They'll just, put more lines of text on a common than you'll see on almost any rare.
Yeah. So I still enjoyed it to a point, but I'm questioning how much I really like Chaos Draft at this point. And I think I'll do it, give it another spin next time, but I'm not sure if I love it. It's the sort of thing
where, I did, I think 4. You do a couple of these and you're like, I don't know if I would want to do 10 of these, but man, the first couple are really fun.
I really enjoyed the first one. Yeah. Huh.
So maybe, I think it's interesting to keep an eye on that. This is the same, like, why isn't Cube available all the time sort of deal, right? Like, right. You have to realize kind of what each format is trying to accomplish, and something like Cube or Chaos Draft is really fun, but might not be fun if it was always available.
Yeah, I think Cube's repeatability is probably higher than Chaos Draft as well, just because you're actually working towards understanding, something. Scott says, do you have any tips on what signals you use while drafting to determine when to go deep into an archetype or for synergy with a bomb or 2 versus applying a more good cards cabs approach? You guys rock.
I think a big way you can determine that is there are some cards which, if you see them at the right time, indicate beyond a shadow of a doubt that that archetype is open. Trying to think of, let's see, what's a good example? Like in Dominaria, if you saw like a 6-pick Saproling Migration or a 7th-pick Thallid Omnivore, you're just like, oh, no one's drafting Saproling. There's no one near me. And because there's not very many ways this could happen. There's always some way, right? There's always like the Saproling player opened a Slimefoot and a Saproling Migration and a Thallid Omnivore. Then the next Saproling player took the Migration and you got the Omnivore 7th.
Yep.
But most of the time when you see a key archetype card super late, then that archetype is open. And at that point, you can be fairly confident that it's a good idea to try and go deep on it.
Okay. De Gaulle says, hey, Marshall and Luis, thanks for continuing to produce top-notch content. I've been listening for a couple of years now, even though I don't draft much. Part of the reason that I can rarely get 8 MTG friends together for a draft. We've done a few 4-person drafts, but the decks didn't feel right with only 4 players worth of packs. What are your favorite ways to get a better draft experience with only 4 players? Thanks again for your hard work. And he says, love from Australia.
So one of them is to do team draft. Do 2-on-2 teams and the teams before. So when you draft, you're passing. The 2 people next to you are on the other team. I found that to be really entertaining because there's so much that goes into it that, where you're like trying to like send fake signals and you're trying to know that the signals you read aren't that accurate and you're hate drafting first pick. It's just a very different experience and I find it to be very fun. The other thing you can do is you can do weirder stuff like Rochester style drafts where you do the packs face up. Like there's a lot of different options you can do, or you can also just draft sets that don't have quite as many dependencies where you're drafting a set that is not quite as high on the like synergy side because that way a 4-person draft can still end up feeling pretty good. Yeah.
And if, you can do sealed. Like I know it maybe isn't excited, but it's like that's real testing in the sense that you're like doing something that you would do at a PPTQ or at a local store or at a GP. And I think sealed's a bit underrated. So Luke says, hey, Marshall and Luis, always like it when I hear a clever nickname for a card like Rock's Pizza Delivery Man or Jace the Wallet Sculptor. What are your power rankings of card nicknames? This one's tough to come up with off the top of our head, but we did come up with a few that we liked.
Yeah, I remember, first of all, Marsh Hulk, which didn't even have to do anything. You could just, it by itself was already just a great nickname, was really good. Marsh Hulk was just a card from Dragons of Tarkir. It was just a, kind of unexciting morph, wasn't particularly great.
Mediocre in every way.
Performed a little better than it looked, that sort of thing.
But it was very big.
But it was big, a little clunky. I always liked calling sensory deprivation from Innistrad Swords to Plowshares. This is an enchantment for 1 blue mana that gives a creature -3/-0. It was a bit of a stretch, but part of the joke was that my blue decks would treat this as Swords to Plowshares when very much was not Swords to Plowshares.
Right. And those are actually some of my absolute favorite nicknames are the ones where we give it a name of a real Magic card, but but it's really tongue in cheek about the fact that it's really not that card, but it's the one that makes you think of it or whatever.
Oh yeah. Rakshasa Gravecaller was one we had to look up. Yep. This is the 4 and a black 3/6. It has exploit, so you can sack a creature when it enters the battlefield. If you do, you get 2/2 zombies. So we called that one Grave Titan.
Yeah, that was Grave Titan. Remember the Herd Caller? I think we called that Thragtusk or something. I can't remember.
Oh, yeah.
The one that gave you 2/3/3s.
3 and a green for 2 3/3s.
Yeah, and then one that I liked was
3 green rather.
3 green. Yeah. One of them I liked. I actually can't remember what the card was called now, but I called it Mill Giant. It was the 3 and a blue 3/3, and it milled people for 3 or 4 cards or whatever.
Yeah,
it was just from a couple of sets ago, but I actually can't remember what it's called. I'm sure there's more, but those are just off the top of our head. Next one comes from Misha. It says, hi, Marshall and Luis. I'm an avid limited player, drafting and cubing regularly at my local game shops, but I've never really been the biggest fan of Constructed. Do you think my aversion to Constructed could be impeding my limited play? And are there any skills for limited that transfer over from Constructed that I could be missing out on?
No, the short answer.
It actually goes the other way, right?
Yeah. People who are great at limited are often pretty good at Constructed. It doesn't transfer the other way so much. So
it's weird.
I wouldn't worry about it in that sense. I do think that being good at Constructed, playing a lot of Magic and paying attention to what you're doing definitely helps. But limited, so much of limited is just about looking at these novel board states and evaluating what you're supposed to be doing. So much of Constructed is about pattern recognition that I would not worry too much about not playing Constructed. I still think you're quite good.
Yeah, you do you, Misha. Whatever makes you happy.
Yeah,
Daniel says
at the end of the day, I do think it is. Yeah, it's important to just play the kind of Magic that you enjoy. So I think that I would not worry over much about that.
Daniel says, hey guys, love the show. I blame my 11-4 69th place finish at GP Phoenix 2017 on the advice I got from the show. My best GP finish ever. Congrats, Daniel. That's a nice finish right there. What is your opinion on the current bribery/wagering rules? Are they necessary evil, or do they get people DQ'd for bad reasons, or are you happy they are there? And then he also says, Luis, to let him know if you ever want to be a L1 judge again. So Daniel's actually going pretty deep here on competitive tournament ethics, I guess, with regards to
it's about ethics in competitive tournaments.
No, we're not going down that road. Do you have a thought on this, Luis? I mean, this is a pretty broad topic, but
yeah, this is not a bit far away from our usual fare, and definitely a judge would ask this question. Basically, I think that it is good that collusion is not something that is not permitted, but the downside is that it often ends up punishing the people who just don't know what's going on, which I don't love. I think that's kind of unfortunate. So
yeah, that is the tough part about it for sure.
I
think that nobody would like it to be openly available, but at the same time, incentives are incentives.
Yeah, I basically wish that I wish you weren't able to ID or concede. Like I wish that every match would just be played out to its conclusion, and that was all that could happen. That's unfortunately not how things work, and it tended to not be how they're going to work either. So,
right, yeah, the incentives for the players are just in place that's just not how it's going to go. So. I guess they're in the best spot they could be given the circumstances, but probably not perfect. James says, hey guys, longtime listener, first time caller, and he wants a Rocket update. I actually talked to Ryan about Rocket. Rocket is Ryan's dog, for those of you that weren't listening in 2009 or whatever when we started the show. Rocket's doing good. He's older now, so he's a little more chill, but still has that fight in him. James says, I was wondering about mulligan decisions when on the play versus on the draw, and where you draw the line between acceptable hands when on the draw versus the same hand that you would not be acceptable on the play. What are you considering when you make this decision? There is a big difference between play draw with mulligan decisions. For sure.
Definitely.
I mean, absolutely a line there.
I think that the biggest part is when you're on the draw, you can keep hands that are missing something, especially like lands, because you just have an extra shot at finding them. Whereas when you're on the play, you have to be a lot more aggressive when you mulligan, because, I mean, you can't really keep a one land hand on the play and expect that to work out very well. Likewise, on the draw, you can sometimes do that, like if you have a really good one lander. And on the draw, you can also keep a slightly slower hand sometimes, though. Being on the play actually, that actually goes the other way. Sorry. Being on the play, I'm more inclined to keep a slower hand because you're on the play and you get to kind of get the jump on your opponent. So I'm more likely to keep a hand that doesn't have a play till like turn 4, let's say, in like a medium fast limited format. Whereas being on the draw, you get the extra card back, so you should be more inclined to mulligan those slow hands. Yeah.
That's right. You basically you have to leverage the time that you have, which is what Luis was just talking about, and then also the extra card that you get, and try to find that line. I mean, being able to actually describe where that line is not really possible. This is why mulligan decisions are such a difficult thing to teach and to understand. There's a lot of feel to it because everyone's unique basically, and every set's different, and you have to factor in like 12 different things before you can actually do it. Is this a fast format? Do I know what my opponent's playing? Is my deck slow? Is my deck fast? What kind of early plays do I have? Can I win off of those, etc.? Another James says, when partway through a draft, how important is it to consider specific cards that your pool is lacking? For example, if red has the best cards for most of pack 1, but you've not seen any of the top commons, would you be more likely to pivot to another color given the option in pack number 2? And then this is really funny, Luis. He says, P.S. I just listened to episode number 100, which awesomely featured then present host John Laux, time shifted host Ryan Spain, and future shifted host you. Yeah. You were on episode number 100.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the show before I was on the show. I do remember that.
Yeah,
it's funny. Cool. I didn't heed that warning, but
no, your future self lied. So this is an interesting question because, James is saying, okay, fine, red's open, air quotes. But what does that really mean, right? Like if you're just seeing a whole bunch of red cards, that doesn't mean that red's open, right? Like you're looking for specific types of cards or the top, say 30% of cards in that color or whatever it is, however you want to view it. But if you're not seeing the top red commons come by, then red's not open.
Yeah, I mean that is what red being open means. It's not can you get 6 red cards in pack 1? It's right. What good red cards have you gotten in pack 1?
Right. So you should always be paying attention to that, James, based on card quality, not just color, and that'll give you a better idea of what's open. And then he also asked about if we consider specific cards that our pool is lacking. Absolutely. There's a lot of times where in a vacuum, you would take card A over card B, but in pack 3, you take card B over card A because it's what your deck needs. You should always be adjusting for that. In the early stages, it's just raw power level. Just go for the most efficient or powerful spell you can. But later on, sometimes you just need a 2-drop.
Right.
Vladimir says, go ahead.
So one of the ways to think about this is, we've kind of discussed it in the context of eating your vegetables, because
being an adult,
everyone wants to eat ice cream and not want to eat vegetables, but clearly bad things happen to you if you eat all ice cream and no vegetables. So yes, everyone wants to take the good 5 drops and not take the boring 2 drops, or take the powerful card and not take the mana fixing. But you need some amount of vegetables, which is 2 drops in mana fixing. So the way I would look at it is, let's say it's early in a pack and there's like a solid, but maybe not the best 5 drop in a decent 2 drop. If you take the 2 drop now, you get to take a better 5 drop later, because you'll, odds are see a better 5 drop and then end up in a spot where you get to take it because you were smart, you planned ahead and you took your 2 drop early. Or like if you want to look at like cube, you take the fetch land or the dual land, you take the mana fixing over the exciting card, because there's a lot of exciting cards in cube, but you need to make sure you have the right mana to play them. And if you make the responsible pick now, you get to make the exciting pick later. So your deck has a lot of different needs, and really a big part of what you're trying to do here in draft is to meet all those needs. So it's always a trade-off. It's part of the reason that when we do these cracker packs, you always hear me say like, yeah, I'd rather take a cheap card. I'd rather take a monocolor card, because the more expensive or multicolor cards you take, the fewer options you have later. It constricts your options pretty severely.
Yeah. And that is the kind of thing that in the moment feels good to just take the powerful card. But when you end up getting your pool together, you're like, can't cast any of these. Vladimir says, hey, love your hard work. When drafting, I have a hard time deciding whether to pick the best card in the pack or pick the best card for the deck I'll likely play. This sounds similar actually to what we just talked about. For example, if I pack one, pick one Sarkhan's Unsealing, I often find myself forcing red-green. Sometimes it works out, sometimes not. Any advice for a medium level player? This is basically what we just covered. You should have a relative checklist in your head, and maybe we'll make a list of this for an episode of the show, of the things that the bars that you should be trying to meet to have a quote good draft deck. With regards to consistency of mana, number of removal spells, a good mana curve, number of creatures, number of things that can give you an advantage in the late game versus the early, and all these other kind of things that you go, I think that when you draft a lot, you inherently get an idea for, okay, I've checked all my boxes. Like this deck has good power level that can win the game. It has a good early game that will prevent it from losing, but also could help it win. It has some card draw so that if I flood out a little bit, I have some insurance against that. And it has the mana to make it all work. These are a lot of the big picture things that you'll need to try to piece together for each draft. And you don't always get there. It's imperfect. So you're trying your best to do what you can do. But those become really important because you can have a really powerful deck. Like this has happened to me a lot of times where I've thought this draft is going amazing. And then I get a pick between a responsible pick, like what Luis was talking about, basically a vegetable pick where I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this mana fixing card that's kind of boring and not really that powerful, but could enable me to really cast all my spells, or another quite powerful, like let's say an uncommon or something like that. And you look at the rest of your pool and you realize, man, my deck is already really good. The only thing I need to actually do are cast these spells, and I'll win a lot of drafts doing this. So you take the mana fixing card over the powerful card, but it can be hard, especially if it's like a removal spell where we're so trained to just take those.
Yeah. And it's, like you said, I think figuring out that full checklist, I think would be useful. But in general, there's just a lot of boxes your deck is trying to check, and you know, part of the skill and the interesting part of draft is that you don't know in which order you're going to be presented with these options, right? It's not as easy as like, all right, I'm going to have 4 different picks where I have to pick between mana fixing and powerful cards, and I'll just pick 2 mana fixings and 2 powerful cards. Done and done. It's more like, all right, I have a 7 out of 10 mana fixer, but a 9 out of 10 powerful card. Which one do I take? What am I going to miss? What do I need later? And you can't predict the order they're going to show up or if they're going to show up. Sometimes you make all the like right picks. You're like, all right, I'm going to take mana fixing over this card, and I'm going to take mana fixing over this card. And then later you just see three packs with all mana fixing and no powerful cards, and you end up with all fixing and no payoff.
Totally.
And you just can't control that. But what you can do is give yourself the best chance of doing of finding all the things you need. And part of that is knowing in the format what is the constraint. For example, Khans of Tarkir was just a flashback draft format. And wow, that format's great, by the way.
Yep.
The constraint there is the fixing. There are more powerful cards than there are fixing. There's no shortage of powerful cards. Everyone gets a powerful card. You get a powerful card, and you get a powerful card. But this is why you should be first picking the come to play tap lands, the tap for 2 colors. And, and gain your life, which is nice too. You end up in a spot where if you have done your homework and you have eaten your vegetables and you've taken all the fixing, then in pack 3, you get to take the Sultai Charm and the, Inward Eye Prophet or whatever, like all these like powerful 3-color cards, the Savage Knuckleblades and Siege Rhinos and this and that. And the person who took the medium powerful cards now either has to have bad fixing or give up really powerful cards for fixing. Because once you get to a point where you just absolutely need something, it almost doesn't matter what else is in the pack. You have to take the fixing. So yeah. I think it's really important to know what the constraint is, because there's some sets where, there's actually a lot more fixing than there are powerful cards. So you should take the powerful card over the fixing. And part of learning every draft format, and part of what we try to do, is look at the format and say, like, what is short here? If everything is well balanced, like in Dominaria, the fixing was a little short, right? That's why Skittering Surveyor was just such a windmill slam high pick. It's why some people thought they had to resort to Navigator's Compass. You end up in a spot where, in order to make your deck good, you have to you have to pick fixing really highly. Whereas there are formats where there's actually like ample amounts of fixing, and you don't need to worry that much about it.
Yeah, I think your point too about like this is where things like listening to this podcast and reading up on stuff really helps you, because you can have a much better idea of the likelihood of what you can get out of the third pack that you actually need and set yourself up for that. Daniel says, how do you evaluate new cards that are added to the MTGO cube? Do you have any heuristics for evaluating cards in the cube? I find this interesting because, I usually, like, sometimes somebody will send me the link and I'll actually look at the cards coming in and out, but I like to just jump in and see them when they show up. I think that's more fun and more interesting. And when I do that, I always have like an immediate visceral reaction to the new card. I'll always be like, ooh, that's in the cube. Sweet. Like Search for Ascantus in the cube. I'm going to play that, and then I'll see other cards where it's like, oh, Tetzamok's in the cube. And I'm like, nah, whatever. Like that goes in this bucket of really powerful cards that I could pick at any point that I want. And I don't really care, like cards that cost, for example, 6 mana and aren't, upheaval or whatever. And so for me, when I look at those, my baseline is raw power level. That's what it's all about. It's either hyper efficiency or raw power level are the two things that I'm looking for the most. And then there's exceptions to that, cards that don't really fit into those categories. But for the most cards do. Most cards you just know right away, like that's an extremely efficient removal spell, or that card is a 4 mana spell that can win me the game on the spot. And those ones I'm thumbs up on, and the rest are like, I'll figure out if they fit in my strategies or not.
Basically, what I'm looking for are the more a card looks like Preordained, Remand, Noble Hierarch, Polluted Delta. Like, basically, I want efficiency. I care about that a lot more than power level. Like, I'm actually not on the same page as you there. I think there's a lot of 4 mana cards that win you the game in cube. There's no shortage of those. Those are actually way more abundant. So I'm way more looking at like, oh, is this a new cantrip? Oh, is this a new way to, to make my deck a little more efficient, to cheap counterspell, that sort of thing. Those are the kind of cards that I'm really looking for. I'm not as much looking for cards that offer yet another powerful 4 or 5 mana planeswalker or whatever.
Yeah, what I do is split them into two groups. So I mentioned the efficiency one. I'm in line with you, but with the power, I'm actually really not talking about 4 mana planeswalker. I mean, I'm talking about extreme power, like things that do broken things. I'm looking for brokenness and efficiency. Like those are the two. Those are the. If you check either of those boxes, you have my attention, and if you're anywhere in between, you don't. Like that's like because I figure the way I look at Cube is that anything that costs like 4, 5, 6 or more mana, 4, 5, 6 or 7, or maybe 4, 5 or 6 are almost all interchangeable to me. Like, sure, they do different things and you want different things in different decks, but they're abundant. They're all completely powerful and awesome, and it doesn't really matter. So I want the extreme stuff. You know, like, for example, a card that would go into the cube.
Extreme stuff, I guess.
I am. Like a card like Craterhoof Behemoth, for example, you know, is a card that I would look at and go, okay, this is kind of busted. Like if I can cheat this thing into play, you know, I can win the game on the spot. Other examples would be cards that allow you to circumvent norms, right? Like, I mean, sure, Eureka's an old card and maybe even not that great, but Eureka's a type of card that I would look at and go, okay, this has my attention. Like, what can I do with this in the cube rather than like, oh, look, it's the new Gideon. You know, it's a 4 mana Gideon. So again, I guess again, in short, I look for efficiency and brokenness. And Luis is all about that efficiency.
Yeah, I think that I'm not as worried about the brokenness. I think that every now and then a new card comes out that is broken, but for the most part, I'm really just interested in the cards that are efficient that make my deck hum.
Piotr says, hey, Marshall Sensei and Luis Sensei. My question is simple. Is there such a thing as too much removal in limited? And he gives a few examples of that. And then also our friends Gar and Gwen had a similar question.
They had the same question.
Basically the same question. Yeah. Like, is there too much, is there an upper limit on limited, on removal and limited? And my answer for that would be theoretically, yes, but in practicality,
there really isn't.
No.
Like, for the most part, you're going to be able to, put together a deck that, like, if your deck is 14 creatures and 9 removal spells, that deck's great.
Game.
Like most formats, that is true. There are some exceptions. There are some formats where like there's a lot of ways to punish decks like that, or there's a couple archetypes that, you know, really don't care about removal that much, but that's just not most limited formats. Yeah. And so to generalize it, no, you're really not going to hit this upper cap on removal. Like you should worry about like how expensive your cards are and how, you know, how your deck plays out. Like the 7th Lich's Caress obviously has diminishing returns because it's just the 7th card that costs 5 mana. But if you're looking at, you know, your second Murder when you have 2 Lich's Caress, a Strangling Spores, a Luminous Bonds, yeah, Murder's still pretty good. I would take it. So
I would like that card too. Yeah. It just gives you so much flexibility. Next question comes from Drew, who says, how good does a double Devotion Bomb have to be for you to splash it in a deck? So I'm assuming that Drew's, you know, 3 red, 4 green, that kind of thing. For example, is there a place for Demanding Dragon in a black-green mid-range deck? How about Patient Rebuilding in a red-black control deck? No.
Yeah, I mean, basically, unless you have something else going on that lets you fix like this, then yeah, you should not be doing this.
No, I mean, because how many you'd have to run 4, 5, 6. I mean, the problem is the number of basics that you need to run without fixing just becomes prohibitive.
Yeah, the example I gave earlier was splashing like a Teferi in a black-green deck, and that was because you have specifically the card Grow from the Ashes, or maybe something like Gilded Lotus, or whatever. You have a card that fixes you all by itself. Mm-hmm. So I would, for the most part, not be interested in playing a deck that has a double color card that's neither of your main colors.
Yeah, it is almost. I don't think I've ever not seen it be a mistake. It's just a mistake to do so. It just messes up the rest of your deck too badly, no matter how good the card is. Thomas says, "Hey guys, thanks so much for all that you contributed to the community. The LR podcast has helped me get to the point where I can consistently qualify for Sunday PTQs online, and I'm considered one of the end bosses at my local game store." Awesome, Thomas. When I'm playing on all cylinders, I feel like I'm a solid player, but I often fall into ruts where I'm just going through the motions, and I'll get to the end of the game and realize I didn't actually think about my decisions at all during the whole game and just played on autopilot. These, of course, are usually accompanied by a string of match losses. How do you keep your mental focus, both in the long run career-wise and also when you're in a long tournament like a GP?
Boy. Well, It's tough. Part of it is training.
You just made your autopilot so good that you can just autopilot and be awesome.
Well, see, yes, kind of. That is true. It has a downside, which is it's hard for me. It's not exactly that I always play on autopilot, but it's hard for me to not rely on that to some degree. And, I've spoken at length about this on the podcast about the difference between intuitive play and kind of like not intuitive play where you're trying to figure everything out each time. And part of what gets me is when my autopilot is off, when my intuition is off, then my play ends up being not great or not as good as I would like it by comparison. So I think that there's a couple of things going on here. One is that if you want to transition from, say, let's say you play, you qualify for the PTQ by going 4-1 or 5-0 in the prelim, right? Which is basically how it works. Or you play a lot of drafts. You're used to playing 3 to 5 rounds a day. You're not used to playing 9 rounds in a day. So you're going to play in one of these long PTQs and start to flag. You start to slow down a little bit. You start to not have as much concentration as you're used to. And you just kind of have to work your way up there. Like I still remember the first 9 round or 11 round tournament I played. It was regionals back when Affinity was legal. And I went 9-1-1. We played 11 rounds on the same day. It was this huge California regionals.
Dang.
When I went to bed that night, I literally was dreaming about ornithopters and arcbound ravagers. I'm not even joking. Like,
really?
They were racing through my head. I was like, this is so weird. How do I stop this? Is this what this is like? It never really happened to me again. But that day I had cast so many of these cards and played so many rounds. I'd never played 11 rounds in the same day. In fact, no tournaments today are even that long.
No.
Unless you like play an 8 or 9 round mocks and play a top 8 or a PTQ, something like that. But I ended up feeling like I was just completely drained and all I could think about was this. It's the sort of thing that gets better the more you practice it. And I think there's some rewards to it. I mean, building up your mental endurance and your stamina is really cool. So that's part of it. The other part is when you catch yourself going into autopilot, try to break yourself out of it, whether that's with, a drink or some reminder or something. Drink, I mean, I mean like a coffee or a water or an iced tea.
Take a shot.
I don't mean take a shot. But these are things you have to fall into, and especially as you're looking to expand the realm of play that you're used to into something greater, or at least more intense, then you do have to watch out for these traps.
Yeah, I think the key is to make it conscious, right? Like is to say, okay, I'm playing on autopilot because it's the first few turns of the game. And then the first time that I have a decision where I really have to actually sit and think, that's the time when you remind yourself, okay, we're in real play mode here. And I don't get to just sit here and just start playing spells at random anymore.
Right.
It's hard to do, but that's a good time to remind yourself. Daniel says, I'd love to hear more about cube strategy, especially the differences in legacy cube strategy versus vintage cube strategy on the current Magic Online offering. For me, the broad stroke strategy is similar to what I was just talking about. I look for efficiency and brokenness, especially in the vintage cube. I look for brokenness, but even in both, I really want to do things that are unfair. And those are the things that I prioritize early. And then I want to surround that with very efficient stuff. That's kind of my, that's my fundamental building blocks to how I approach the cube generally.
Yeah, same. There's more emphasis on broken stuff in vintage cube. And so what that means is in legacy cube, for example, there are a lot fewer fast mana cards. So cards that provide cards like Mox Diamond or Noble Hierarch, any sort of mana accelerant goes up in value because there aren't the Moxes. Signets, for example, go up in value quite a bit. And cards that rely on fast mana go down in value. Stuff like Upheaval's a lot worse in Legacy Cube than it is in Vintage Cube. Basically, in Vintage Cube, if you're not doing something broken, I think your deck tends not to be very good unless it's like super disruptive. Whereas in Legacy Cube, you can draft a fair deck and still get away with it. I don't think every Legacy Cube deck has to be broken.
Yeah, that is true. You can actually go to the middle ground. Colin says, hey guys, this is more of a question for Luis. I'm a middle school teacher and I have tons of students who love gaming. Since you're a game designer, I'm curious, what academic skills do you think are important for aspiring game designers to cultivate while they're still in school?
That's pretty interesting. I think that
what classes did you take at school that help you now, Luis?
Well, statistics helped a lot. One of the things that I would recommend almost to anyone is getting yourself. You don't have to be an expert, but getting yourself to be comfortable with statistics. Because first of all, that helps a lot because we're presented with a lot of statistics in the course of our everyday life. And you're going to find yourself getting tricked or taken advantage of a lot of people who are trying to prey on your inability to understand what the statistics mean. Like, you know, anyone with an agenda can easily use statistics to push that agenda. So trying to figure out like, hey, what is a sample size? What is a confidence interval? Like what is a standard deviation? Like knowing all those concepts is really useful, I think, to anyone. Another thing that's really useful to know is know how to express yourself, how to write. I find a lot of what I do as a game designer is trying to express ideas to other people in a way that's effective, whether that's trying to write text that people will see in game or announcements or, you know, any sort of communication to your players, or just communicating with other people who you need buy-in to make these decisions, right? Like whether it's putting on a pitch to your boss who you need to approve it, or to talk when you're discussing with other designers in a meeting and you have this idea you think is really good. Being able to kind of verbalize that idea and explain it and make it so other people understand it is really important. So communication is just a huge part of it. You know, I went to school for political science, and while that is not really what I'm doing at all, I do feel like I got value out of a lot of those kind of classes. Math is good in general. I think if you want to be a game designer, I think a background in coding is good. A lot of people come into the industry through either being able to design and develop their own games and demonstrate that, or understand enough that they do some amount of that. That's something I'm actually not good at, but I came in through a kind of different path than most anyway. So, I would not necessarily recommend be a professional gamer then go into game design path, though that has worked for a lot of people I know.
It has, yeah, but that's also worked for a lot of people you know because you know them.
Yes. So I think in general, I would focus on like it's a mix between hard sciences like statistics or like math, and more understanding like social sciences. So it is both those things. Being able to write and understand and think critically is just always something I find useful. So the cool thing is there's not that much super specialized knowledge I think you need to be a game designer, but you do have to understand a lot of different things. And I think you have to understand them pretty well, because people make way worse decisions when they almost understand something but don't understand it than if they don't understand it. Like, I feel the most dangerous. Like, I've actually described a lot of people I've, interviewed or worked with as they know enough to be dangerous.
Yeah, that's a good descriptor for sure.
So,
yeah. Yeah, good. Hopefully it works out, Colin, to get a bunch of young people on that.
Yeah, I would love that. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Jaeger says, hey guys, if my goal is to win an MTGO limited PTQ, how should I divide my practice time between sealed and draft to maximize the odds? Do the percentages change for GPs? This is interesting, of course, because these tournaments are played using the Swiss portion being sealed deck, and then the top 8 is played at booster draft. So if you have no idea how to play sealed, or if you're really bad at sealed, your chances of ever getting to draft in the first place are significantly impacted. So it would stand to bear that you should probably focus a little bit more on sealed at least. But that said, if your goal is to win the dang thing, you get to the top 8 and you haven't done a single draft, well, then where are you at? So I don't know, probably 60-40, 70-30 in favor of sealed. There's obviously a lot of crossover between the two, right? It's not like if you're practicing sealed, you know nothing about draft. You're learning a lot of the cards. You're learning the interactions that they have, how powerful they are, how they play out, but you're not doing it in the proper context for each of them. So it's not great learning for the other. I think I would probably start off by really trying to feel like at least I got somewhat comfortable with sealed, because that's what you're going to have to do if you're ever going to get a chance to draft. And then the rest of the time I would spend drafting to make sure that I had my sea legs under me. It is a big undertaking, but a lot of these tournaments take place much later in the format, so you can actually pretty comfortably get to both of them.
I would say that most people don't practice enough sealed. I think sealed is a more skill intensive format than people give credit for. So practice more sealed.
Yeah, practice more sealed. You got to get good at sealed if you're going to be able to draft in these things. Paul says, "Hey guys, really enjoyed the episode with TBS about what to know before going to your first GP, and I was wondering if you think there are any tips that are more or less relevant for attending a PPTQ." And I asked, since you and I haven't played in PPTQs of late, I asked Adam, who did play his first not that long ago, what he thought. And he said it was competitive REL. So that was something that was a little bit different. And we talked about in in the episode with TBS. And he says that at the time, registering decks wasn't a thing that he had done yet. So if you haven't played in one ever, then, be aware that you're going to be registering your deck, and there's kind of a process around that. That will be explained to you. So it's not like you have to know a whole lot going in, but it is something that can add a little bit of extra work at the beginning of the day to you. And he said it made him a little bit nervous, but otherwise it wasn't really a big deal. So they're pretty normal tournaments. If you've ever played in a Magic tournament, you will be just doing a few things that you wouldn't be at the next level. Also, if you do make it into the top 8 and it happens to be limited and you're going to be doing the draft, don't be surprised if it's a timed draft. And also, keep in mind the extra rules around competitive drafts, which are that you don't get to look at the cards whenever you want. You draft them in a single face down pile, and then you'll be given a specific time in between packs where you get to look at the ones you have, but it's pretty short. So get used to doing that too, in case you make it to the top 8. And good luck, Paul. Chris says, "Hey, limited mom and dad." And Chris says, "I'll let you figure out who is who."
I don't know how I feel about this, but all right.
I don't know if I like it. I had a question about drafting sets with weaker themes, such as M19. I found it a lot harder to draft a plan than with Dominarius. Quite often, there just wasn't much you could do within an archetype. In a lot of cases, even though the colors seemed open, I ended up with decks that lacked impact. I keep wondering if I'm undervaluing certain cards that would make a difference, or if I'm drafting to a plan, or if drafting to a plan gets a bit more difficult in core sets. Having said that, I did manage to 6-0 a league in M19 on Magic Online, which I attribute to all the hard work my limited parents put into making sure I was raised right." Chris. Okay. Yeah. So your expectations for impact with core sets should be adjusted down. It is often much harder to get a deck that has true synergies in it, although sometimes there are some available, especially when they happen to come together, even if that's not particularly often. A deck that we talked about since the beginning of M19 was the blue-white artifacts deck. And if you get all the pieces for it and a few of the key uncommons, it's really strong. It's a really good deck, but it relies on those uncommons so heavily that you often don't get those pieces together. And that's just something that you're going to have to deal with. But you have to also remember that it's relative. Everybody else is facing the same thing you are as well. And while it can feel kind of bad when somebody does put together one of those insane decks and you're just going, I'm casting creatures that have power and toughness, and you're casting these things that get all these benefits because of these artifacts and all this other stuff, it doesn't come together that often. So it's just a little bit of bad luck. The key for you is to make sure that you keep your eye open for when those select few archetypes are available, because you want to pounce on them when you can, because you will actually have a significant
you do have to just change your expectations when you go from a high power format to a relatively low power format. And your decks aren't going to be as sweet or do as many things, but remember, other people's decks aren't either.
That's right. Nicholas says, "Does your opponent's mulligan decision ever affect your own? Are you more likely to keep a mediocre 7 if you know your opponent is going down to 6?
It's actually the other way around. If I see my opponent mulligan, that makes me more inclined. Well, it can go both ways. Sorry. I'm less inclined to keep a sketchy hand when my opponent mulligans, because one of the reasons you don't want to mulligan, right, is because you're going to be down a card and you might not have the best start. When your opponent mulligans, they're also less likely to do that. So you don't need as good of a hand to beat theirs. So if you, for example, let's say you have a 2-land hand on the play, and the hand is okay, but has a risk of ruin, right? You could just never draw a 3rd land, or a 1-land hand on the draw. If you knew your opponent was going to mull to 4, you would instantly mulligan both those hands, because you don't want the variance. You'd rather just have a hand with 3 lands that you can actually play your cards in. You don't get to know that exactly, but sometimes your opponent mulls to 6 and you have to then decide whether you want to mulligan. And I think it should move the needle towards mulliganing. On the other hand, if you have a hand that's kind of the opposite, a consistent hand, let's say a hand of like 5 lands, a 4-drop and a 5-drop, and you're on the draw and you're like, wow, this hand's really just not great, but your opponent mulligans to 6, I'm a little more inclined to keep that, because your opponent's just not going to come out quite as fast, and that your hand is going to hit its land drops and has 2 spells to play. So I'm a little more inclined to run that. Basically, your opponent mulliganing means that you're more likely to tolerate risk of having a slow start, but less likely to tolerate risk of having a hand that doesn't do anything.
Yeah, that's super unintuitive, I think. I think most people think you mulliganed. Okay, I'm going to keep this junker because I have more cards than you, and I'm going to try to leverage that advantage. But I agree with you, Luis. I think that it actually goes the opposite way. Nicholas says, Jethro says, hey guys, love the show. My question starts off kind of sacrilege. He says, I hate Dominaria Limited. I find it to be a bomb-heavy Prince format whose game ends in top decks war. And I know I'm in a minority here. He says, #don't at me. He says he also didn't get to play very many drafts because he was moving this spring. I assume this is fine. I've not liked formats before, and then they rotate and we get on with Magic. My problem. The question is, Dominaria seems to have been inducted into the format's Hall of Fame, which I think that is true. Like this is an all-timer now, where all future sets get compared back to it, like Khans, Rise, or Innistrad. How can I maintain my perspective on future sets when my comparison point is so vastly different to that of the Magic influencers I trust? He doesn't like Dominaria, but we're sitting here on the show saying we think it's one of the better formats we've had ever. I mean, you should play it more, Jethro. Like, don't move when one of the best sets comes out.
I mean, it's totally okay not to like a format, but the part I don't get is like, why does it matter if you think this format is bad and other people think it's good? Like, I understand what you're saying. You're like, oh, other people are comparing this format to other formats, and I think this format's bad, but yet they're saying it's good. It's like, let people enjoy the things they enjoy. I don't think it matters that much. Like, I don't think it matters that you think that Dominaria is bad, and someone's like, wow, this format's great. Like, what I'm not clear about is why that really makes that big of a difference.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if Jethro listens to us or other people say Dominaria is so great, he may go out of his way to play it or do something. But yeah, you're just going to have to play each format and decide what you like, especially if yours tends to differ from what the majority likes. Tim says, hi guys, finding the show interesting and informative. Keep up the good work. 2 questions here. The first is that Guilds of Ravnica, we're going to see 5 two-color tribes split it between 8 drafters. Are there any strategies you apply to that sort of format? We'll answer that actually when we get into actual guild stuff. So I'll put that one on the back burner for now. And then the second question is that an old set, there's a store called Axion Now that Tim plays at, is doing a Khans of Tarkir draft tomorrow as part of their draft cup. And I've never played the set before. What is the key things I should know before going into that?
Khans of Tarkir. The biggest thing is the lands are better than you think. The tri-lands, the uncommons are Windmill Slam first picks. And I would take the common 2-color lands that come to play tapped and gain you a life over basically every common. Like, I think that I would rather just start with a common tap land than I would any other common. So that is
and that's a huge statement, by the way. I mean, for people that don't know, that's crazy
than other people, than most people tend to think, though a lot of people do also employ this strategy. So basically take the lands first, figure out the powerful cards later, draft 4 to 5 colors and you'll be fine.
Yeah. And that, by the way, is the key, is that you're going to get good stuff. Even at common, you will get good stuff. So don't worry about that part. It's about enabling the ability to cast and or transform them. Starbright says, hey guys, started listening after getting into Magic at Comic-Con shortly before Dominaria. I've heard comments about things like, oh, Ixalan was a bad set for drafting, but I never quite understood what that meant. What makes a set bad for draft?
The short answer is it's not interesting, but that's not a very useful answer. Basically, when we say a set is bad for draft, what that frequently means is that the themes aren't supported. So you have a lot of cards that don't do anything. Like, that was one of our problems with Origins. Is one of the very successful things that Magic sets do these days is they have a bunch of build-arounds. So they have a bunch of like uncommons usually that say like, hey, if you build a deck around me, I'll do something cool. Like, there's cards that rewarded you for Delirium and Innistrad, and there's cards that reward you for having a lot of morphs in Khans of Tarkir, and that's great. Those cards are really successful. Yeah. They're really low cost to the novice drafter because they might see a secret plans in Innistrad and be like, wow, I don't really get what this is doing, and ignore it. And they totally can do that. They can just draft all the Mardu cards and be fine. Whereas the person who really wants to have a replayable draft experience can draft these like decks that do a lot of cool things in the late game and are more complicated. The formats where those don't work tend to feel not great to a lot of people because that's a lot of what keeps you coming back for your 5th, 10th, 15th, 50th draft. And it also feels pretty bad when you first pick a Gyrup or Ether Grid, one of the cards in Origins, and it doesn't work. Because it's like, wow, you tricked me. I thought this card would be good, but it was not good. Like, why did you trick me like that? So I think that part of the complaint with Ixalan is a lot of the build-arounds just didn't work. And a lot of the cards in the set, or a lot of the themes of the set, this is the other part, were such that the set was really fast and didn't let you block. So one of the frequent criticisms that we get on the show here is that we like control decks too much. And yeah, we do have a bias towards those in some ways. What I think leads to a good format isn't necessarily the speed, it's the interaction. We had this discussion on the LRcast subreddit last week or 2 weeks ago. Part of the problem with Ixalan is that there wasn't much interesting interaction. When no one's allowed to block because of all the, evasion creatures and benefits when attacking and all this stuff, that there's no counterplay, there's no back and forth. You're both solitaring, and that's just not that interesting. People want to be able to play a game. So complaints about sets often come with no one was able to block. The set was not necessarily too fast exactly, but too uninteractive. And Ixalan just hit a low note on a lot of these things. Like, there was tribal, but it didn't really matter or play out that well. One of the big themes or best decks was this like hexproof merfolk deck that had so little interaction. See, like, that wasn't even about speed. It was just about interaction. There just wasn't any. And people ended up being unhappy for a lot of reasons, but mostly relating to these things.
You touched on the tribal part too. That also sours the draft portion, where if you first 3 picks are, merfolk cards, you kind of know how the rest of your draft is going, and you haven't even opened up your second pack yet. It doesn't leave a lot of open-ended space for exploration or imagination or excitement. It's just basically, did I open some good uncommons, and do I know the difference between the commons? And that just wears thin pretty quickly. Yep. Star also says, asks if we were at PAX. They thought they saw us spell slinging there, but no, we were not.
It was some different handsome gentlemen.
Yeah, indeed. Fran says, hey, Marshall and Luis, when preparing for a big sealed event, what is more important, create a sample of a good deck in the format or identifying the best archetypes?
Sample of a good deck's more important because, I mean, it's good to know about the archetypes, but it's not like that critical that you need to know exactly what the best version is. Just knowing the broad strokes is good enough. I think knowing what's an acceptable deck is more important.
Yeah, especially because Fran's asking about sealed. It's like you don't get to choose anyway. Paul says, hi, Marshall and Luis. I've been listening to LR since I got back into Magic during Theros. I haven't looked back since, and I've been playing limited on Magic Online with the occasional F&M as well. Your episode about GP really got me excited to try and do a live event, with the caveat of I don't know how to get into Constructed. How does a limited player get into Constructed? Which format, which deck, any resources recommended to improve?
Well,
so you need some money.
Well, there's not necessarily. It depends on what your goal is. One of the formats I always point people to, especially people who listen to the show, is Pauper. I'm just a big fan of Pauper.
Oh, yeah.
I think Pauper's awesome. For those who don't know what Pauper is, it's kind of as the name implies. You don't actually have to be a Pauper to play it, but it is accessible because the only cards legal are commons. There's nothing that isn't everything that's uncommon or rare is not legal. So what's so sweet about this is that you can build a deck for not a huge outlay of cash. The decks aren't free. They're not 5 cents. They're not $2, because some of the commons, are hard to find, and some of the decks use a lot of these old commons. But you can get a deck for, between $20 and $60, and maybe less depending on which one you want to play. I find the gameplay to be good, and there are now Pauper events at every Grand Prix, pretty much, and there's always Pauper available online. So it's actually a format you do get to play, thanks to like kind of the early progenitors of the format, grinding it out and making it feel appealing, even though they didn't get a ton of chances to play the format. Mm-hmm. That said, if your goal is to, like, say, qualify for a Pro Tour or compete in the main event of a Grand Prix, you're probably better off looking at Standard. Standard is less imposing than Modern. Modern's a really hard format to get into, and I think that you're going to find more results, both in terms of it's cheaper to put together a Standard deck, and that there's less confusing things going on in Standard. The downside is if you find a Modern deck you really like, you can often play it for years, so your year-to-year cost is much lower. And Modern cards tend to hold their value pretty well. It's a pretty good value proposition. If you bought into a Modern deck 5 years ago, you actually made a bunch of money, depending on the deck.
You were doing good. Yeah, definitely. also, I like the idea of getting in on a deck early in a format and sticking with it. This gives you two benefits. One, it gives you the best chance to just get good with a specific deck since you don't have a wide-ranging understanding of how the format works yet. And that could lead you to winning more, and that's good. And then the other reason is because you do get to understand what the other decks do, even if you don't play them directly, by playing against them and understanding how to combat them. And sure, it's not quite as good as actually playing them themselves, but not many people can just get all the decks in a format. So pick one and stick with it. And yeah, it might not be the best choice on some weekends, but that'll help you really get a foothold in the new formats. Peter says, hey guys, I have a question about mana bases and splashing, which I'm sure you get asked a ton. But as a new player, it's tough to really get a grip on. As an example, in M19, I might be in blue-black and take a speculative Cinder Barons mid to late pack to allow me to splash an Electrify. Would you ever try to splash a card like Lich's Crest? How much fixing would you need? My rule of thumb is it needs to cost at least 4 mana and only be 1 mana of the splash color, but are there exceptions if this is even correct? So I want to focus on that last part, Peter, because I think we covered the splashing stuff pretty thoroughly earlier about don't splash double colored spells really unless you have like a specific type of fixing. But the rule of thumb is close, but not quite for you, Peter. At least 4 mana and only 1 color isn't quite right. The 1 color part is, but the 4 mana actually isn't relevant. It's the question is actually when is it relevant to cast the spell rather than how much does the spell actually cost. For example, you're talking about splashing for Electrify, which meets that requirement. But let's take another card from a recent set like Cast Down, right? Well, you would also splash for a Cast Down because it's better than Electrify.
Even one in a black, destroy target non-legendary creature.
Right. And that's one of those things where you wouldn't want to not splash a Cast Down simply because it costs less mana. Now, your brain is going in the right direction. You're saying, well, if it costs more, then it's probably better in the later part of the game. And that's when I'm more likely to have actually enabled my splash to that point. So I'll do that. But instead of coupling it to the mana cost, couple it to at what point in the game will this card be good? And that will give you a better idea of that. And this is a good one, is that any time in the game, Cast Down could be good. It might be turn 10 and Cast Down's still good, right? Much like Electrify, which generally speaking, at any point in the game, it would be good as well. So focus on that a little bit more, Peter, but otherwise you're on the right track, and listen to what we said earlier about the double splashes and not doing it. Jamie says, are there ever any sets that you just don't get? For example, in Dominaria, I felt I could get there most of the time and had a fairly high win rate, but in M19, I felt even when I had a decent deck, there was times I was 0-3. I guess I just never really got it.
Yeah, there have been sets that I never really understood. And yeah, it's rough because you end up in a spot where you feel like you don't know what's going wrong, and it's really hard to know how to improve. But what I always have, the solace I always take is that it does eventually rotate. So eventually you're onto a new set, and at that point, then you can just get to start over. Because sometimes there's just a set I'll just come to a point where I'm like, I don't really get it. I'm not gonna bother with this set anymore.
Yeah. And I felt that way too. But the fact is that we're a little different, Luis, because you and I both draft so much, right? That I always feel like I get there on one, at least I understand, like even if at first I didn't quite grasp it, that I at least get there at some point. But,
I mean, I basically
your
never
average Magic player doesn't.
I basically never got Zendikar, original Zendikar. I lost so much in that format. I did poorly at like 2 Pro Tours and like 3 Grand Prix in that format. And I just,
Crazy.
At the end was just like, I'm off it, whatever.
Yeah. You just moved on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's smart. A few more questions here before we call this thing a show. AJ says, with the advent of more weird formats like Chaos Draft, how do you play around tricks? It feels like you lose equity by playing around unknown tricks, but, and he says, as Marshall showed me in round 3 of his Chaos Draft video, he's talking about one that's up on Channel Fireball, you can get absolutely smashed by some if you aren't careful. Do you just need to accept more blowouts, or would you play more cautiously into open mana? Thanks for the content. PS rewatching the match from the other side was very informative, even if the truth wasn't enough to win. I wonder, did that video get posted from the other side? I didn't realize that. The truth. Do you remember the truth?
That's
Algae Gariel. That's one of my best. Yeah, that goes on the nickname Hall of Fame for sure, for me at least. So this is a great question though from AJ. So normally you have this subset of cards that are instant speed, effect combat, or in the colors that your opponents are playing, and you should be able to snap those off, a few weeks into the format pretty quickly. Bless you. But when you're playing Chaos Draft, that list is extremely long and too much really for anybody to be able to understand the concept of, besides what you've actually seen in the match itself. So what do? Do you assume that they have something, even though you can't really even figure out what that something could be? Or do you not? I tend to not. I tend to, within reason, make them show me things rather than play too conservatively. And I tend to do that even in sets where I know what they could have. But when I really don't know what they can have, I kind of take the blinders off and I just go.
Yeah, I think...
from a general perspective.
I think in general, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of assuming my opponents don't have it. I find a lot of my peers, especially like a lot of really good players, are a little bit more conservative than I am. I just assume my opponents don't have it, and sometimes they don't have it, and it's great. you get paid off really big when they don't have it.
Yeah, I think the big thing is to recognize that how bad is it if they do have it? If it's I lose the game, okay, fine. But a lot of times it feels emotionally bad to get got by one of these spells. But when you look at it from like a card economic standpoint, it's like, oh, it's just a 1-for-1.
Yeah.
Like, and why am I so heartropken about that?
I've talked about this before. The player curve goes from not playing around anything to trying to play around everything. Whereas it is somewhere in the middle. Because people, once you understand that you can play around cards, once someone says like, no, don't attack there, they could have destroy target attacking creature, or no, don't block. They could have, this giant growth. Then all of a sudden you're like, wait a second. Wait, you can play around cards, and then everyone just wants to play around cards forever. And
that's right. Now I'm just a huge calling station. I just block every time. Make them show me the card. Clayton says, hey, Marshall and Luis, the question is pretty simple, so I'll just fire it off. What has been your favorite card to play with in any limited format? Obviously, too difficult to pin down to one, but a few that I had was Eldest Reborn recently. Urban Evolution is a card that I absolutely love. Dinrova Horror and Tatiova came to mind as well.
I think Burning Vengeance is like my all-time favorite card.
Oh, that's a great one.
I love Burning Vengeance.
Great pick. Yeah, I love that card.
It just led to drafting really sweet decks. Likewise, Spider Spawning was really cool. I loved drafting around Creeping Sensation, or what the enchantment from Innistrad, that was the Shadows over Innistrad, which was like at the beginning of your upkeep, mill 2, and then every time you mill a land, you get a 1/1 insect. I just really love that card.
Oh, I remember that card.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it was called, but yeah, I remember that one too. Next one comes from Eric, who says, my question is about when to play around something versus when to make them have it. I guess we just covered that. Good question, Eric.
We played around that question. Bam.
Yeah, we did. Colin says, hey, Marshall and Luis and Magic Online, when is the point at which we should switch from intermediate draft to competitive draft queues? Obviously, there's a point where the expected value of competitive draft queue is greater than the intermediate queue, but it's harder to win in competitive than versus intermediate. How do we know when we're there? This actually is kind of a moving target as things change around on the economy on Magic Online, but there have been articles written that showed kind of what you would need to do consistently to eclipse what you could make in the intermediate ones. But I think perhaps more importantly than that, it goes to kind of what your goals are. Because if you're playing in the intermediate draft queue, you get to play all 3 rounds. So if you just love to play and you want to really understand each of the draft decks that you've gotten, you're going to pay a price for that, which is A, your prize pool is not as high a payout if you happen to be very good at Magic and can win consistently. And B, you're not playing against the best competition. And I do consider that a price. I know many people would consider that a benefit because they could win more. But come on, you want to try to challenge yourself and play against the best players you have access to. And this is, for many people, the best way to do it. If you really are looking to just simply be the best player you could be, then you want to play in the competitive draft queues for fairly obvious reasons. That's where the best players play, and that's where the prizes are the best. But it's also going to cost you, and it will be the type of thing where if you come home from work and your evening is, I'm going to throw on the TV and I want to do a draft, you may not really like the idea of drafting a sweet deck, getting mana screwed in round 1, and just being done with it. that might not sit very well with you at all. And you think, well, I really wanted to sit here for an hour or two and play some Magic, and now I'm just out and I don't want to, re-up and buy another draft. Right. You may just want to stick to intermediate. So I like those reasons a little bit better, especially because it's so difficult to tell the exact win rates.
Yeah, I'm a lot less high on expected value and more on, like you said, what is the experience you're looking to get? I'm a very pro-experiential person. I find that a lot of the things that I care about the most in life just are experiences rather than things. Unless you're talking about beta cards, then the things win. The things are much better there. But I think that if you want to draft the deck and play 3 rounds with it, play the intermediate queue. If you want to try to get to become the best Magic player you can be, generally the competitive queue is the best place to end up in, even though you would want to start in the intermediate or potentially even the friendly before that. So I think that it really is more based on your goals and what you're trying to get out of it than it is on what the EV is. Because I think in general, if you play Magic for the EV, you're not going to end up being very satisfied with the results.
No, and I do this myself, by the way, just to use me as an example. I'll play in the pre-release drafts, and then but before the Pro Tour starts or whatever the major tournament I'm going to do first, I'll play in the intermediate queues. And the reason I do that is because I want to get a chance to play as many games as I can so that I can understand how the cards are interacting and what they're doing and get used to and see as many cards in play as possible so I can sort of solidify them in my mind before I get in the booth. And then afterwards, I'll transition over to the competitive queues because that's where I actually want to be drafting, not for work research or whatever. Josh says, Marshall and Luis, can some people just run better in certain limited formats? I have found that my win percentage is significantly higher in Dominaria than M19. Same with Rivals versus Ixalan, or is this because some formats are a little more flat for everyone? Is it like playing football in a downpour? It's anyone's game, regardless of the game plan. Thanks. Sample size.
There's 2 things that I would look at. Yeah, one is sample size. If you do 5 drafts of each format, you could end up with wildly divergent records, regardless of anything else, even if equal skill, equal everything else. The other is that maybe you understand a format better than other people do, and you might not realize it. It's hard to quantify that. But at the end of the day, if you have better results based on a certain format, then maybe you are better at that format than others. I wouldn't say that particular formats lend themselves too much to that. I mean, there is some aspect of that. Some formats are like, if a format is much higher on variance and lower on skill, then that could be a format that someone has, especially someone with a lower win rate, could end up with more wins than they normally do. Mm-hmm. But in general, something like this could happen.
It could. I think that a lot of this is just sample size. I mean, how many are you really doing, Josh? Are you doing 150 drafts per set to understand your actual win rate? It's hard to say. A lot of it's anecdotal. Jonathan says, I've enjoyed drafting on Arena over Magic Online because Arena is inexpensive, graphically superior, and the games seem to go quicker. Do you guys draft on Arena? If so, any thoughts on the differences between Magic Online and Arena drafting? Also, will spending time on Arena stunt my growth as a limited player? Thanks, guys. Great show. I have been actually, I've been streaming for Wizards, Tuesdays, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. and, on their channel. And I've been, they want to put Arena in front of people. So I've been doing that. And, that means that when I'm not streaming there too, I've been poking around in Arena and really trying to get super comfortable with every aspect of it. And I've really enjoyed it a lot. The thing to keep in mind, then, the major difference between Arena and Magic Online is that when you draft, you're not drafting against other people. You're drafting against an AI that is simulating what other people would do in other seats around you. And that is a major difference. How it's different, really hard to say. It feels roughly like a regular draft with some exceptions, but I'll tell you what, every time you draft on Arena and you see a good card go late, you think, oh, wow, the AI really screwed this up. How could they let that? But then go to any local game store on a Friday where they're drafting, and you will guarantee to hear somebody
don't call
say,
people AIs. They don't like
that. Yeah, these are, what are they called? NPCs?
Oh, man, yeah.
You'll hear somebody say, how is this card still in the pack? What are you guys doing? You know, that kind
my
of thing.
favorite part about drafting locally.
Yes, the commentary that runs. And, you know, so these things do happen even in a natural draft environment. So, yes, I have enjoyed it a lot. I agree with you in many ways about the graphics and the gameplay and stuff. It does feel a little more streamlined, and it's pretty cool. Will spending time on Arena stunt your growth as a limited player?
Nope.
Stunt your growth is probably a strong statement, but I mean, if you're looking for optimal, you would still be on Magic Online because it's more closely related
currently
to
the
true
competitive
draft.
players are on Magic Online because Magic Online has a lot of faults. I don't think anyone would argue otherwise. But one of the biggest problems with Magic Online is this steep barrier to entry. But all the good players who play on Magic Online have paid that cost already. So it's easy to not remember that, right? When you're like, I'm going to fire up Magic Online and play a draft, and you're like, it does that. It perfectly does that. You can play a draft on Magic Online, and you don't notice that. For someone who hasn't played Magic Online before, there's a lot of weird, confusing things going on. What that does create is a selection effect where the people on Magic Online tend to be more invested and more hardcore on average. And that's part of what they're trying to capture with Arena, of course, is the people who don't want to play Spreadsheet the Gathering in order to figure out how to join a draft. And as a result, right now, especially, the competition is just much greater on Magic Online. Look, I've been watching people stream Magic Arena, and there's a lot more Navigators, Compasses, and Damping Spheres being cast in the Dominaria queues than there were on Magic Online. So
I once had 3 matches in a row, Luis, where my opponent led with Sparring Construct.
Right.
3 matches, not games, like every match. It was on the stream. They were just like, what is going on? And, you know, Sparring Construct maybe found its tiny home somewhere, but but generally speaking, it's not what you want to be doing. And they were just running it out for power level. So that absolutely is something. So you very well do, like, I get stunt your growth. I mean, you know, at least you're still playing, I guess, and practicing, but you are not being optimal if you're on Arena, at least at this point, even in the competitive queues. Yeah. He also says, I love burritos, but I have to go on a low carb diet.
Oh man. The period of time where I lost the most weight was actually when I was eating at Chipotle 2 or 3 times a week. Because the burrito bowls, which is just a burrito without a tortilla, sadly with no rice, were a very good substitute. I found that to be, not as good as the original, because there is something about holding a burrito and eating it. The tactile part does matter, but a burrito bowl, just you can get a lot of the good value without paying the steep cost in carbs.
All right, we've got a couple of questions left, but now you've made me very hungry, so we have to cruise here. David says top 5 limited format since Luis joined the show. I came up with the first 3 that came to mind, which was Cons, Dominaria, and then Hour of Devastation, Amonkhet.
I loved
those are the ones that stood out.
Yeah, I loved all of those formats. I'm trying to think if there was one in recent history that I liked more. I actually like Shadows over Innistrad a lot. I think SOI would make that list.
I remember liking Eldritch Moon.
Yeah, Eldritch Moon was also very good. So, but both of those formats.
Okay. Seth says, hey, Marshall and Luis, love the show. Ben Seck was on the show last week and mentioned that Huey Jensen's run at Worlds last year was the best stretch of technically optimal play he's seen. That got me curious. What would you two estimate as the percentage of games you play 100% optimally? Is that a realistic goal to strive for? 0 and no?
Yeah, basically.
I mean, not literal 0, right? Like there's some games where you have very few decisions and you can look back and say, I think I made each of them. It's just extremely rare.
And there's some games where afterwards I feel like I played really well. Like I had some games in the VSL last season where I felt
when you ran over the other teams by yourself week after week. That was insane.
Where I felt like I had a game with Dredge where I blind therapied twice in spots where it mattered and like constructed this game plan from turn 2 that really bore fruit on turn 7 or 8. And I felt really good about those games. But what in a percent of games do I play technically perfectly? That's just, it's got to be really low because there's just a lot of small things that matter. Like, which tap line do you lead on turn 1? Because if you lead with the blue-white tap line on turn 1, it implies that you don't have a red card in your opening hand in your 3-color deck. That sort of thing that, like, yes, you can think about those edges, and sometimes I do, but most of the time you just shouldn't waste your brain space on that. So.
Yeah, and then is it a realistic goal to strive for? No, it's not. 100%
here's what you should
optimal play is not a thing.
You should strive for recognizing your mistakes. I think if you recognize your mistakes and learn from them, you're doing exactly what you should be doing to get better. Because the only thing worse than making a mistake is making a mistake and not noticing you made a mistake. Because then you don't get better. Then you don't fix it.
Kevin says, well, first question, he said top 5 sets for Chaos Draft together, but I have no idea.
Yeah. I would generally avoid the really linear sets, like drafting Scars of Mirrodin with its poison sub theme is just like kind of weak. Like it's just not that fun.
Yeah, the Infect decks don't come together very often.
I would just go with old sets just because those tend to have some cool stuff going on.
And then last question, what deck building tips can you give players for team sealed events, and how do team sealed events differ from solo sealed events? We've actually done a show about this, but the general take on it is get an idea of what you want to do ahead of time as far as who's opening packs, who's writing stuff down, who's going to make the final decisions on stuff, just so you don't walk in and have to figure that logistical stuff out. For team sealed, the decks are going to be much, much more powerful than a solo sealed event, and that lends itself to having much different criteria. If the set has a strong synergistic sub-theme to it, you will often be able to hammer that really hard for one of your decks. And that's something that you don't even get in booster draft all that often. So you should be prepared for very high ceiling on your decks and be willing to build towards those, even if they're not the type of decks that you've normally seen from your sealed or your draft decks. At least they're not as good. Make sure that you don't screw up the sideboard stuff, because, each person gets assigned their cards and those go in their sideboard, and you can't switch them later. So make sure that those end up in the right spot. Anything you want to add to that?
I think that team sealed is knowing what each player is good at playing also helps, because you want to assign the decks too. And ideally you have each person building the deck they're going to play. Like you should switch it around a few times, and switching decks just to get a new eye on it is good. But like at the end of the sealed build, the person who has the deck in front of them the longest is generally the person who plays it. So make sure those decks are in the right place.
One more add on to that. I have a question, because you've done these tournaments before. Is there merit to having the best player play the worst deck?
No, I think it's less about that and more about each person playing a deck that they're comfortable with. Like when that tournament actually where we played against the the LR listeners earlier, I mentioned we had Pat Cox, who's a noted white weenie aficionado, and that's where he has most of his tournament success. He played the nearly mono white beatdown deck, because that's just what he's most comfortable playing, and he'll get a lot of mileage out of it. Whereas I tend to play all the bad blue cards, because that's generally what I feel comfortable playing.
If there's anybody that can get mileage out of those, it is you. That is for sure. All right, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks so much to our patrons for submitting such awesome questions. I love that we're able to do this, and we've made it a regular thing. It really means a lot that you support us, but us being able to give back in such a direct route is a real treat for us. And thank you for doing that. The show is brought to you by channelfireball.com. That's the place to go for everything you need Magic related, including selling your cards. I always try to mention this when we're talking to some of our listeners about getting into Constructed. Boy, if you got that pile of draftwares, go over to Channel Fireball, punch them in, and you can see how much you can get. If you want to trade them in for other cards or sealed product or pre-order stuff, whatever it is, they're going to give you a 30% bonus back. And that is such a big benefit when you're trying to scoop up a bunch of mythic rares for your new standard deck or whatever, if you're trying to transition into Constructed. So absolutely take advantage of that. It is just one of the ways that you can help get ahead and keep yourself playing this game that we all love. I can be found on social media. I'm Marshall_LR, and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com with all the old episodes, including some of the ones that we referenced in this very show. That's going to do it for this one. We'll see you next week.
So I feel like every couple of months I should give a public service announcement. The last time, this became relevant was when Lantern Control was getting very popular in Modern, like won the Pro Tour, people were playing it. And now it's Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, which has prompted this. It is okay to concede games that are not concluded. Games where you have a very low percentage, we're talking sub 1%, you not only can you concede them, you in fact should concede them. And the more I play with Teferi, which I'll get to in a second, that Teferi is an abomination, the more I see that people are hanging on to try to eke out that extra win percentage. But it's false, A, because they're not going to win the game. When your opponent has a Teferi emblem and you have no cards in play, you aren't winning that game. when they have a Teferi on 7 and 7 cards in your hand and you have 2 cards in your hand, you're still probably not winning, but maybe you shouldn't concede. Once they take that thing up to 8, once they ultimate it, at that point, you could probably call it a day, move on to the next game. Or if it's game 3, move on to literally anything else. Going to the bathroom, getting a drink of water, sitting there and wondering what went wrong. Anything you could be doing, checking your phone, like there are
standing in the corner, staring
at
the wall.
No better uses. And I remember at the Team Pro Tour, Mike Segrist was playing humans, and he played against a Teferi deck in Modern, and his opponent had an emblem, 6 cards in hand, and Mike had like 1 land in play and like 2 cards in his hand, and I look over, I'm like, you can concede, right? He's like, oh well, it's a team tournament. Are you sure it's okay? I wanted to play it out. I'm like, I look over again. I'm like, no, Mike, you can concede. Like, it's just not going to happen. And I think that some people are on this like never concede school of thought, and I actually think that like that is just not great value, because even from like a tournament win percentage, I think you lose percentage because you end up playing worse at the end of the tournament if you drag out every single game, and that's not even counting the fact that it's like game 1 and you want to finish a match. Then it's like hugely damaging to your win percentage if you decide to take 35 minutes in game 1 because you don't concede when the writing's on the wall, and then you don't get a chance to finish out the complete match. I'm not recommending the Ben Stark school of thought, like concede when you're sub 10%. You miss your third land drop and you just pack it up. Like, no, don't do that. But you can concede games that have pretty much inevitability. Look, a meteor is not going to fall from the sky and hit your opponent. They're not going to draw a sideboard card in game 1, like hang on for that kind of edge. They're not going to forget to activate their Planeswalker. Like, those are just things that are just not really going to happen. So don't try to get that. That brings me to Teferi, the person who made me say this. I know how Teferi happened. I know that, at some point, someone templated Teferi. Templating is deciding like what the words say. You might know what the card wants to do, but you still have to like write it out, right? Someone wrote out Teferi and they're like, oh, put target permanent, non-land permanent, third from the top. Like, I bet at some point someone said like, should this be another? And it's like, no, we can save a word. Because one of the goals when you're templating cards is to save as many words as possible. The fewer words on a card, the better. That is just, overall, that should be your objective. You should not try to use 7 words to explain something where you can get away with 5. The problem is Teferi really needed that extra word. It really needed to say another. And it's the sort of thing that when you're like trying to make this card and you're trying to template it, you're like, are people really going to put their own Teferi back? No. And then they move on. The problem is if you played one game with Teferi where Teferi targeted himself in order to deck the opponent, because that's what happens, right? Teferi emblems exiles all your opponent's permanents, and you're thinking like, oh, how are you going to win the game? What's your win condition? Your win condition is -3 targeting Teferi, putting him third from the top. 3 turns later, you draw Teferi, minus him again, and you basically never run out of cards. It should only have taken 1 game before you realize like, wait, we should say another. And then that would solve a lot of problems, because that would force these decks to put actual win conditions in their deck. It would force Turbofog to find a way to win the game that does not involve minusing Teferi. Or some of these blue-white decks, like one that won a Grand Prix, had maybe 1 or 2 creatures, but for the most part was just looking to Teferi deck your opponent. And the problem I have is that it leads to these games where your opponent either has to concede, which some people just won't, or the game is going to just take 45 minutes to conclude, because even if your opponent is not stalling and is just drawing their card, playing their land, passing the turn, it still takes a while to run some of the cards manually. you have no cards that are helping do that. Oh, yeah. And Teferi leads down that road. So it is a pretty disappointing way to end games, and it's one we're going to see a lot of in both Standard and Modern. I'm playing it this weekend. So Teferi, the format got substantially worse because of the lack of the word another. And I get that Teferi has a lot of words on it, but man, I wish I did not have to talk about, when to concede, because Teferi really does prompt that conversation.